Folks, my name is Kevin Knieriem. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer here at Clari, and I have the privilege and honor of spending the next 45 minutes with former four-star General Stanley McChrystal. General, thank you for being with us.
Well, it's an honor, Kevin, and I hope you'll call me Stan and everyone.
I was going to get to my line as we talked the other day. I said, you know, it's kind of intimidating to get to do a 45-minute dialogue with someone who has been and seen what you've seen. And so I talked about this. I did my research, right? I watched your TED Talks. I read your great book, Team of Teams. And I was going to ask you, right, what does the general like to be called? You said, don't even worry, it's Stan. So for the rest of the 45 minutes, we'll call you Stan. Stan, thank you for your service to our country. I know everyone that's on this call with us today feels the same way. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. I just appreciate it.
Yeah. So why did we ask you to join us, right? Obviously, Cornelius was really excited and I was, but it had a lot to do with your book, Team of Teams. Really talks about how an organization, as it faces ever-changing challenges, needs to be able to work really, really well together. And at Clari, right, is a company that's growing fast with higher and higher expectations from our board, from our investors, from all of our customers that are on the phone here, and from our employees, right? That we need to be nimble and we need to be able to grow fast. And many of us on the phone today, right, we have a customer journey that never ends. It continues to grow. And if you think about the complexity of all the parts of an organization that need to touch that customer, it's pretty intense and pretty immense. And so how do you help them work together? And then the other side of the coin really was leadership. And a lot of great leadership lessons that we've got to learn from you as we've read the book. So Stan, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
You bet. So a little bit of background on Stan. So most of you probably know who Stan is, but I'll give you a little background. So Stan spent a long career in the United States military, leading the U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. 150,000 men and women soldiers in his command, plus 45 coalition nations, and then all the supporting cast, right? The State Department, the CIA, the FBI. A tremendous amount of responsibility. And prior to that, Stan led JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, right? This is where our most elite warriors, SEAL Team 6, the Green Berets, the Army Special Operations, Delta Force, all these amazing, well-equipped, well-trained organizations under his command in trying to turn the tide, right, of the war in Iraq. And the genesis of the book really came from his learnings in leading that organization. And Stan, here's where I'd like to start our conversation this afternoon is, going from this, organization that was created out of the aftermath of the Vietnam War and bringing together these specialists. The traditional military is a pyramid, right? And as you fight, a traditional opponent, they're also aligned in a pyramid, right? Decisions go down, information goes up. JSOC was different. Can you give us a little background on the genesis of the book and the learnings coming out of that?
Well, I sure can, Kevin. I'd start with where you did. Traditional militaries were designed to get large groups of relatively young people, do something that was unnatural, go in harm's way, and do it in a tight group. And that required a lot of discipline, that required a lot of efficiency, that required order, process, all of those things. With somebody in charge that was brilliant that told the big structure where to go. And that was okay if that's what you're fighting against, because then it's just a question of sort of maneuvering against that and being better. And in fact, when JSOC was first formed in the aftermath of the failed Iranian rescue mission in 1980, it still had that DNA to it. It was still designed on very tight processes, strong chain of command, a lot of great values. But if you look up the word adaptability in the dictionary, you're not going to see a picture of the United States Army. The reality is that's just never been the strong suit. What we ran into in Iraq, unlike any terrorist group that had ever emerged before, Al-Qaeda in Iraq under a young Jordanian named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi didn't fight like a traditional structure. They didn't have midnight meetings and tight discipline, control. And so as a consequence, they looked disorganized, but at the same time, they were really lethal, really fast, and constantly adapting. As I've used the analogy before, it's like facing a threat when you're scuba diving and you think it's a great white shark. Well, that's a problem, but if you see the shark, you at least know where it is. Then you have a school of piranha which come from every angle. And you can't kill a school of piranha because there's just no way to go after one. So what we faced was a challenge like that, and JSOC had to change itself fundamentally, starting with processes, but really going down deep into our culture, which is the DNA of the organization. And that was a pretty significant emotional as well as a physical transformation for us.
And you've written 3 books now, right? And I think you mentioned you have a 3rd one on the way, which is about risk. And I think I heard this in the video you did. You said you got smarter the day you left the military. And I know what you mean by that. It was a little tongue in cheek because you're pulled away. But what, of all the things that you learned, why did you want to write a book or books that are really focused on corporate America and helping corporate America evolve?
It's a great question, Kevin. It's because we had this experience in Iraq where we transformed. It was so different from what we thought we were going to have to do. And it was uncomfortable, but it turned out to be very effective. And then we walked away with a hypothesis that what we'd gone through wasn't unique to war. It wasn't unique to counterterrorism or to Iraq. It was a reflection of a modern environment. And that modern environment says that things are faster, there are more variables, and it increases the complexity. And that's not limited to any single organization. Every organization is now operating in that environment, which means we've got to have a different set of qualities. Instead of predictability and efficiency, we've got to be really fast and we've got to be very adaptable because we're shooting at moving targets now, and we always will be. And so I became very fascinated with what can we do to help organizations of all kinds shift how they operate in their minds and in their processes so that they're better. Over the last year, we've spent a lot of time working with state governments to respond to COVID-19 because it was a disorientingly new challenge. But the same challenge, it's just a different look, the same challenge businesses face now.
Yeah, and what I'd like to start to explore is as you think about how you transformed, this organization, JSOC, there were a lot of building blocks to it. And one of the ones that I, really took to heart coming out of this was trust affirms purpose, and purpose affirms trust. And this isn't just at the top, this is at all levels of anyone who has to work together. Talk to me, how do you institute this in an organization that is that large? And, every unit in there probably has its own DNA and its own way of being.
Sure. In the military, particularly in special operations, people have a sense of purpose. They know why they're in the military and why they're serving. And there's deep trust within the teams that they serve. But it didn't scale. And what that meant was Delta Force and the SEALs and the Rangers didn't have a shared common purpose. They each had defined it themselves a bit. And they trusted the people that were in their team. There's a great quote from a SEAL that I got that says, there's a point at which everyone else sucks. And only a SEAL could be so eloquent, but what he was saying was, the people on my close team and in my platoon or family, everybody else is someone else, and I therefore don't trust them. So the problem we had was we had immense amounts of cohesion, purpose, and trust in small teams, but it didn't connect across. So what we had to do was give a shared purpose, a common purpose to everyone across the force, something they all looked at and agreed with. And then we had to start to build trust outside of your little tribal group across the entire organization.
How do you do that? I got a little nugget of it out of your book, which is you called it embedded. And that sounds easy, but you said, you don't just take someone, you take your best. And you take your best person, you put them in another organization. We talked about this a little bit last night in that in some areas it just works, in others it might be more difficult. Talk to me about how you do this amongst these elite units.
Yeah, if we think of what trust really is, and I ask you what you trust, You'll tell me I trust my family, I trust my pastor, or any number of small group, and I'll tell you, you trust McDonald's. And you say, no, I don't really like that food. That's not the point. They have over time created a common expectation. When you see the sign, you know what it costs, you know what's available, and you have a general idea of the experience, so you can make an informed decision. What we found in our forces is familiarity doesn't breed contempt, it actually breeds trust. But they didn't know each other. So we started by taking really effective operators who were influencers in their own world and cross-attaching them to other organizations, not for a day, but for 4 months at a time. And they first went with much, kicking and screaming and with much trepidation. But after 4 months, they'd go back to their organization and people would say, wasn't it terrible to be with them? And they'd say, no, they're actually just like us. And that trust extrapolated. And then we would create cross-functional teams so that people were working with people organizations they weren't familiar with routinely. Once you've been in a firefight, then this magical trust builds up because you've shared an experience. So we realized you had to manufacture the interaction, you had to force it. And then we also created daily venues, video teleconferences with all the organizations so that you saw and interacted with people constantly, and trust just starts to arise from that. And then when you match it with a common purpose, they're all trying to get the same thing done, and they trust the intentions and the capability of the other, then you start to see real progress. But Kevin, if I tell you that this was easy and I just got in front of the organization and said, trust your brothers, that's absolutely not true. It was like getting magnets that are in opposition and holding them together. But it works. You
use some examples that were interesting in the book, and I think it's about how do you help that person that's going over, into that other organization to get in the right mindset. And there was an example of a soldier who, had a hard time right away fitting in. He said, I'm just going to go into the trash and bring food for 2 weeks and 3 weeks and see if I can earn their trust.
Yeah, it's interesting. We actually sent him down into the embassy in Yemen, and I had asked to put a person down there, and they didn't want him. And so when he got there, they almost shunned him. And so most people, because he was an accomplished SEAL officer, a tremendous talent, but instead of reacting like I probably would have, which was, treat them poorly back, he just started emptying the trash. And then one day they said, we need something taken to another building in the city. And he says, I'll do it. And he became a courier. And he did that. And then after about 2 weeks, suddenly they started bringing him into conversations. And he created this persona that people trusted and appreciated his selflessness. And that kind of thought, he was so mission focused that he was willing to not act like a stereotypical special operator. He was able to subordinate his ego to the mission.
Amazing. I'm going to come back to this topic as we start to talk about some of the lessons you've learned from big companies that you've worked with. As we're kind of thinking about the restructuring of the org to adapt to the enemy, one of the areas that I thought was really interesting is you talk about training and you talk about educating. And you and I talked about this example the other night. Here at Clari, I've got an amazing group of sellers that have experience from 20 years old to my age. And we ask them to go work with some of the greatest companies on earth and advise them on their go-to-market strategies. And so how do you help take someone who's beginning of career and give them the experiences that I've had in 25, 30 plus years of selling and close that gap? And so we created what we call a Revenue Academy. It's about educating, not teaching. I know in the military, right, a lot of it is you've just got to get repetitive motion to understand the basics. And then from there, how does that become foundational in the creation of Team of Teams?
Right. One of the things that was already strong in JSOC in all the years when I grew up in it was individual proficiency, because everyone was specially selected. And then we put them through extensive personal training programs so that they were not flawless, but peerless in marksmanship, physical training, and whatnot. The problem is that only gets you into the game. That keeps you alive in that moment when, It's very, very difficult. It doesn't prepare you to make decisions in uncertain situations, but it takes away that part. So you don't have to think about those things. You don't have to try to remind yourself how to block and tackle. In the moment, you can think larger. Now, what we found we had to do, though, is to create in people the ability and the comfort to make initiative-based judgments, was to put them in those situations as much as you can. And you can't manufacture real situations for everyone, because the cost to create action, to put people in actual combat just for the experience would be crushing. So you set up training exercises that have no right answer, that are full of uncertainty, that take that foundation of proficiency, but they don't confuse that for actual effectiveness. You've really got to be able to just stand on that foundation and operate. I think there's tremendous opportunity for simulations now, technology to do that in sales and in other things as well, to create role-playing exercises that are very realistic. But you've got to put people in places where they're uncomfortable before they really learn. And that's the education side of it, as opposed to the training, which is, I think, skills-based.
Yeah. So now we're an organization. It's adapting to a new enemy. We've got common trust and purpose. We're evolving. We're being educated. We're embedding in other groups. And you started to talk about systems engineering. A lot of folks on the phone here come from IT backgrounds, so that means a lot of different things. But in your world, it really meant understanding the complete picture, right? And then from there, how all the pieces fit together. Talk to us a little bit about how you started there, and then last night we chatted a bit about what it evolved to, and I thought that was pretty fascinating at scale.
Absolutely, Kevin, because trust and common purpose, if you told me this before the experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, I would have nodded and said, yeah, that's important. I wouldn't have had the same understanding, but it would have been solid. The next one we call shared consciousness, and that's a common contextual understanding of what's happening. And you say, well, wait a minute. If everybody knows their part of the process, if everybody on a football team knows what they're supposed to do on a certain play and executes it flawlessly, then the play will go well. And that is true. But the play never goes well because the opposing side never cooperates. Things are never exactly the same. So what each individual has to do was have an understanding of their role, but a better understanding of what we're trying to do, the big picture. And in a complex environment where things are constantly changing, you can't have centralized direction because it's not fast enough. It doesn't have enough information. So each part of the organization has a role, but then as you execute, they have to keep adjusting what they're doing so that the outcome comes as well. If you think about in combat, you got a number of soldiers and they come up with a plan, and the great saying in combat is no plan survives contact with the enemy. And so as soon as the battle starts, that's out the window, except for the general idea of what you're trying to do. And then people just are adapting like a school of piranha. They are adjusting and moving. And so what we found was, how do we share that information in real time? Now, on the one hand, we're running into two problems. We'd never had the technical capability to do it before. In 2003, that was solved because suddenly we had digital communication to every soldier and the ability to watch that we never had. And I had in my ops center 12 big screens. I could watch every operation as it was unfolding and being conducted. And we had 17 of those ops centers around Iraq. So everywhere could watch it. So the technical part of it was an enabler that didn't exist before. The other part that was cultural, because we grew up in a world where you sort of didn't tell everybody your business. You've seen movies where someone says, you don't have a need to know, so I'm not going to share that information. Of course, the fallacy of that is who knows who needs to know. And so we tipped it the other way to transparency, and we said everybody sees everything all the time. Now, that's obviously not attainable, but that was the bumper sticker we used. And if everybody knew, every decision you make was empowered by this contextual understanding on a level we'd never had before. So now everybody on the battlefield is a general. And, laugh about that because in special operations, everybody thinks they're one. But the reality is it allows them to adjust, and the role of the organization in centralized control recedes way back.
In our world, in leading sales, right, we talk about this concept of each of the individual contributors having a franchise, and that franchise, it's their company, and our job is to provide the resources and make sure that those resources, technologies, tools are available for them to put to use, and that our role is to make their job easier. And as you were discussing the 12 monitors and the command center, you said, look, I'm not going to call the shots on all 12 missions happening at the same time. I'm going to make the tools available for those leaders to choose what they need.
That's exactly right. If we think about the old days in special ops or in the Navy, you'd send ships out or special operators out, pat them on the back and wish them well, and then they either came back successful or not. And it was a lot of fate and it was a lot of luck, but you didn't have the ability to adjust much because you couldn't provide them support. You couldn't change things as you went. That's not much different than sales. We used to send salespeople out and good luck, and if they came back, good. But we can't operate that way anymore. We've got to be able to surge resources. So the beauty of those operation centers was not that I could watch every soldier doing what they did and micromanage them, but that I could marinate in the information, appreciate what's happening, move resources, connect organizations in the moment and say, hey, you might be able to help these guys. Move resupply, move medevac to this element. And then the people on the ground, they're still making it happen. They're still making the decisions. They're still doing all that. But they get reinforced by the entire organization as opposed to being out alone and unafraid. And so our ability to use technology and a change in culture can make everybody more effective. And then cumulatively, of course, the synergy there has an effect as well.
And what I found interesting is, your the amount of operations every evening and every week increased dramatically. But you said your teams would go out and they would capture a suspect, and that suspect would have a lot of data with them, right? And then that team would turn it over to a team that would look at the data, and then the data would be passed to another team, and then action would be taken. It's very true in the world we live in, right? Whereas we'll acquire a new customer, that customer then gets handed over to a team that's responsibility to get them live, make them successful, and then another team that's responsible for keeping them happy. Those breakdowns between, I think you call blinks, right? And there was the concept of the hourglass. In a world where, right, those elite warriors are not the data specialists, there's probably another organization within the United States, the FBI, the CIA. How did you help that become almost factory-like?
Yeah, I didn't even know we had the problem when we started. But when I first took over, I went and into this intelligence facility, and there were bags, plastic garbage bags, and they were full of intelligence, things that had been captured, pieces of paper, equipment, whatnot, and they hadn't been analyzed. And intelligence is like fruit. Very quickly, it rots and it's of no value. So I looked at the people in there. I said, well, what's going on here? And they said, well, when we get around to it, we will have translators look at it, and then we'll see if there's any value. And the issue is the blink you described. People fought and sometimes died getting that intelligence. Then they sent it up, but when it arrived, it didn't have the same meaning to the people receiving it there. It's just more grist for the mill. They sort of put it in the line and they process it when they can. Then they get the outcomes of that. They pass that information on, and the same thing happens again. The new people down the assembly line don't have the connection to what's happening, the context, so they process it like anything else. And we had a cycle called the find, fix, finish, exploit, and analyze. What we found is there were blinks between each of those, not because people are evil, but because you're passing it between people and organizations. So we brought all of that organization into the same ecosystem. We shared the information all the time. We connected them diagonally and talked about everything. And what happened was, as everyone understood the context and what mattered, you started to build trust. You start to have this thing go from, took about a week when I took over for that stuff to go, to we could do it 3 times a night. Something could be captured, exploited, analyzed, put back in, somebody could operate on it 3 hours later. Part of that was helped by modern communications, but the biggest part was helped by connecting everyone. Everybody felt like they were doing the same operation. It brings me back to the old story of John F. Kennedy when he went to the Houston Center for NASA and he ran into a janitor sweeping the floor. And he says politely, "What are you doing?" And the guy says, "We're putting a man on the moon."
So awesome.
Yeah.
That is an amazing story. I think you call this collective intelligence, right? Where all parts of the organization are one, they have a purpose, they know their part in the mission, they know the other pieces of the operation and how they work and how they fit together and how their job is as important as the rest. In the book, you start to talk through some corporate America, some of the largest companies in the world that you've had a chance to work with. And one of them I thought it was interesting that you mentioned was Ford. After 2008 and the recession that we went through, how Ford emerged as a leader in building cars, and it took this coming together of all parts of the organization. How in your now civilian life are you able to take those concepts to really, really big companies? I think you also mentioned Deutsche Bank is one of them.
Absolutely. Done a lot of work with Deutsche Bank, some big healthcare companies inside hospitals, which is amazingly siloed almost by definition and culturally. And so what we found is the first thing to do is you have to pull everybody up to 30,000 feet so they all see the overall mission. If you go to MD Anderson Hospital, a cancer hospital in Texas, everyone knows they're there to defeat cancer. Every single member of the organization. And then hopefully what they do is they make all of their decisions through a lens that says what best supports that particular part of the mission. Now, it's still challenging in every organization. We found there are certain things you start with. You start with that common purpose and trust, and you have to work to build it. You have to change some processes to provide shared consciousness or that common contextual understanding we talked about. What we did in JSOC was a daily video teleconference. When I started, it was 50 people, and it went to 7,500 people. It went to everybody in the command every day. And when I tell people this, they roll their eyes and they go, "That's the mother of all meetings." And I said, everyone in the organization got reconnected, resynchronized on what we're doing, and did it. And then the final part's empowered execution, and that was pushing the ability to make decisions much closer to the point of action. In some cases, it's right to the person. In other cases, based on experience or conditions, it's not as far. But the idea is push the decision-making empowered with this understanding of what's happening. And then everyone not only can make better decisions close, but they feel like they're owners. They feel responsible. And that changes their connection to the mission.
Regarding missions, you talked about a young analyst who was watching, a known terrorist that you wanted to capture. And traditionally, this would have had to come all the way up to you for approval. But this young analyst who was trusted by his counterpart said, "Let's take action." A mission was spun up quickly. During the mission, the suspect split into two cars, and the mission had to adapt. We see this on TV all the time in the movies we watch, and it sounds like something that special operators would do. But the fact that this wasn't happening before the shift in sharing and trust and transparency, that a really junior person could make such a big monumental call.
Yeah, you've got to change your mindset. We killed Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was a pretty effective leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And the night after we killed him, I flew down to Baghdad and I only gave one medal. And there were a bunch of people, hundreds of people have been involved we've been after him for 2.5 years. I put one medal on the intel guy you talked about. And everybody was happy. He didn't go on the target. He was a little bit pudgy, a Southern accent, and he was a funny guy. But what he had done was he had kept us focused. At a key point in the mission, when we're all leaning over and everybody's excited to do this and do that, he said, "Stop, wait, hold off, don't do anything. Don't do it yet." And I mean, even I was sort of leaning forward, let's go. And then at the appropriate moment, he says, "That's it. We've just seen the thing, it's that vehicle." And that was a big chance, but he had built up trust with all of us. He was so focused, and he was the right man to make the call. And that's to understand that sometimes and forget what the job title is. The right person to make the call is the person with the perspective to do it.
Yeah, I mean, amazing. We see this in our world, right? We ask our sellers to go out and engage, and anyone who takes care of a customer to engage. They have targets, right? Our targets are traditionally a quota, and those reps need to go make their quota. Now they usually have an NPS score, meaning what's their customer satisfaction, and other metrics. But it's always that primary revenue, and we as leaders sometimes can interfere in their process because we have a number to hit. And I always ask my reps and our team before they engage me, what do you want to accomplish? What role do you want to play? And by the way, it's your call on what we end up doing, not mine. And I've been impressed when you empower them that it's their call to watch what actually happens. And typically what happens is they achieve what they wanted.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We had a process in place that said I had to make a decision to drop a bomb on any terrorist leader, which was obviously going to kill them. And so they would wake me up and they would bring some information to me and I would make this decision. And after about 2 months after I took over, I said, why are you doing this? Why are you bringing it to me? And they said, well, that's our process. We got to have a senior wise person make it. I said, well, you wake me up. All I know is what you tell me. If you're waiting for me to bring some other great wisdom in, you got the wrong guy. Why don't you just make the decision? And they kind of looked at me and they said, well, that requires change of process. So we changed the process. And at first people were worried that younger people closer would be quick on the trigger. They would not be as responsible. The opposite occurred. They were very responsible because they owned it. But at the same time, they were much quicker. When it was right to do it, they could do it. When you see in sales, often you got to walk away from a potential client because there's a sixth sense that says this is not going to happen. But at the highest level, it's hard to make that decision because you're looking at aggregate numbers of potential, things. And so you're pressing people, no, don't give up. And that person says, no, we should spend our time and effort here. And that's why I think that you've got to trust people down the chain.
Yeah, it's so important. And usually, to your point, right, they're at the front. They're at the action. They know what's actually happening. They're adapting to all of the signal that's coming in. And in our world, right, what's traditionally happened is the manager interrogates the rep to actually find out what is happening at the ground level because we couldn't collect data and we couldn't make decisions on it. Obviously, where Clari plays in, right, is we're trying to provide all of the go-to-market teams with a common lens of what's actually happening. So that we as a company or our customers can take the right action. And that flow of data now down and up is so important to a growth organization, just as important it is to the military. Now, I thought, as you were in the book, you were talking about tour duty. And more importantly, the mission at hand, which was to obviously to win the war. And you said to your troops, you said, if and I thought this was a great story. If I was to say, you're not going home until the war's won, what would you do differently, right? In growth companies, we think about, what is the path for our organizations, right? In many cases, it's we go public, we become acquired, we're always thinking about what is the next milestone. And I think the reframe is, what is it that you're actually trying to offer to the world, and how can you change things? And so, how did you make that mental shift in your organization?
It's a really key point, Kevin, because we sometimes reinforce people for doing the right thing, meaning following doctrine in the military or following a checklist or whatever, even when their intuition tells them it's not working and it's not going to work. Or in the case of military, we had tour of duty. If a person did a certain amount during that tour, they were really incentivized not to make big changes because someone else is going to follow them soon, and it's going to be their responsibility. So the question that you described, I would go to young sergeants and lieutenants and I would say, what would you do differently if you couldn't leave? And they would get at first they'd chuckle, they'd giggle, and they'd go, wondering whether maybe this 4-star might have the power to do that to them. And then once they got beyond that, they gave very thoughtful answers. They said, sir, the problem we're really trying to solve here is this. And in Afghanistan, it usually meant stop going after the Taliban to kill them and start trying to solve the problem in the society, because that's why the Taliban exists. And very young people having these very perceptive views on it. And then you then got to empower them to be able to follow through, to execute on that. And that takes a lot of adjustments, because their answers were sometimes very different from what I was seeing 300 miles away in the headquarters in Kabul. I had to recognize that I've got a lot more experience, but they were up close to the problem. And they pretty bright people.
As you kind of evolve that thinking, one of the things that we ask of everybody in every company today is they almost have to do more than the job they signed up for, right? You talked about your soldiers now having to do community engagement, changing the narrative. We ask a lot of our teams, especially now that we're in this last year of COVID, last year of social change. We ask so much more of our people, and now we ask them to do it from their homes, right, in a virtual world. And everyone has had to adapt and change and deal with a lot of challenges and difficulties. I still can't imagine that it compares to what soldiers being away from home have to do in a war zone. During those long periods of time, and I think yesterday you talked about this, you did almost 5 years, right, overseas, and your staff stayed with you and did 5 years overseas, as did a lot of the soldiers who never got to leave that environment. How do you keep them mentally in the game? How do you keep them mentally committed through so long of uncertainty?
Yeah, it's a little bit like building a company. If you think about it, you start a company on a thesis and you get support, but it's not a sure thing. And so you ask people to commit a part of their lives, a part of their time, their energy, their effort, their ego at this thing that may or may not work out. And there are days when it seems like it won't, and there are days when it feels very good. And that's the way war was for us. And the hardest thing about it was the fact that there was some doubt. They'd read the press, they'd hear things that the United States would step off its commitment. I found the most important thing I could do was to signal my commitment. I used to tell people, when I'm going to give up on this? Never, never, ever. And we are going to keep at this. And I once, as I described last night, told a congressional committee that came out to visit, and they said, how long can your soldiers keep it up? And I said, until they think you're not serious, until they think you're not committed. And then you will lose their ability to have that same level of commitment. So what I would say is the most important thing is to create this idea of a shared mission, a common purpose, that we are doing this together, we are focused, and we are not going to stop. And people take great pride from that. Even in the tough times, they look left and right at the men and women that are with them, and they feel good about doing it, even if it's really hard.
If you believe in that shared mission, that shared purpose, as the leader, you do and you have to. You talked a little bit last night about your leadership style, which made me laugh because it's a lot like my CEO, Andy Burns' leadership style, which is constantly applying pressure and pushing. And you use this example of, I wasn't going to set a benchmark that we had to hit in the number of missions we could run, because honestly, I didn't know how many we had to hit until we could turn the tide and start to feel our enemy to start to feel our stress. I thought that was a really unique leadership principle, which is how to know how far to push your organization to get the results you needed to achieve success.
Yeah, and to give a little bit of additional background on that, we were trying to defeat Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and when I started, I took over, we're doing 1 raid a week. And we thought that was a lot of pressure on them because we were about 70% successful, 4 raids a month. And then we found out that they acted like they didn't notice that, and we ramped it up, and we got to 18 raids a month after about 9 months. which is a raid every other night. And I thought that would do it. It wasn't even close. So we just pushed the organization, said faster, more, figure out whatever we got to do to put more pressure, which meant more operations and whatnot. And when we could start to see that we were getting ahead of the curve, we were hitting a speed and an intensity that they couldn't match, then we suddenly realized, okay, we have figured out the solution. We're not there yet because it took about 2.5 more years of leaning at that speed to do it. But what that meant is the organization had to understand we are going to defeat them. That's the idea. We're going to do whatever it takes. And I told the organization, I don't know the right answer for this, but I did a big hand wave and I said, we're going to do whatever works. If it works, we'll do more of it. If something doesn't work, we'll stop doing that. You guys figure that out and we'll iterate our way to success. And my role was, as I had described last night, is I sort of put my hand on the back of the organization and just push and just keep pushing. I never let up the pressure because I always felt like we could do more. And I didn't yell. I don't, do big pronouncements. I just, no matter what we're doing, there's the constant pressure that what we do this week isn't going to be good enough for next week. And people responded really well to that.
Did you ever find any breaking points where you had to just sort of pull the hand back a little bit?
Maybe there were some. I didn't. Believe it or not, it was Christmas Eve night one night, and one of my operator sergeants came and said, sir, there's another organization that says they're not going to do any operations on Christmas Day. And I said, okay, why would they do that? And they said, well, nobody wants to have to inform a family that their loved one was killed or injured on Christmas Day. And I said, no, that's not us. We're here to win. And if we win quicker by maintaining the pressure, that's what we're going to do, period. And of course, so some smartasses in the headquarters wrote a night before Christmas poem, a parody of that about my pronouncement. But the point is right. You're there to accomplish what you have to do. And I think that's the leader's role. You don't give up, you don't get tired, you don't waver. And the organization takes heart from that. You don't have to be the brains of the organization, but you have to provide some of the heart.
Yeah. Stan, we have a little less than a minute left, and I wanted to end on this. One, first, thank you. This has obviously been a privilege for me to get to spend the amount of time I have with you and to ask these questions. And I know everybody on the call feels the same way. I want to just leave you with a question to all of us, maybe, or a challenge, or parting words of wisdom. And maybe it's around evolve, right? Is you've had to evolve your entire military career. You've had to evolve the U.S. military. You've had to evolve special operations. How do we get ourselves in the mental state to constantly evolve?
Yeah, Kevin, I think it starts with a level of personal humility. And that means that we never have the right answer. Even if at one moment we figured something out, we pat ourselves on the back, we got promoted, we made a lot of money, whatever it is, we start to think that we've got the right answer. We're wrong because the problem keeps shifting. It shifts in that the problem you're solving is shifting and the people you lead shift. And so every day you go to work to lead, you're leading a slightly different organization against a slightly different problem. And so if we think that we figured it out and everybody's got to fall in line with our leadership pronouncements, we're probably incorrect. And so if we just pay attention and constantly allow, maybe force ourselves, as you say, to evolve and adapt, then we'll be better leaders.
Fantastic. Stan, thank you so much for your time today. We greatly appreciate it.
My honor. Thank you.
You bet.